Coming up, I guess there's one thing you have to remember when preparing Joe Biden for a speaking engagement. You can't give Joe Biden too many instructions. Welcome back to Political Spirits. I'm your host, Franklin Rye. We still stand for the proposition that the left and the right should have a few drinks and talk. Compromise is not a requirement. If those discussions result in us changing or even abandoning our positions, that's fine. If they don't, that's fine too. We just need to talk to each other. In that way, we can unify through speech. And if the discussion becomes a bit heated at the end of the night, we should still be able to split up the bar tab and be on our way. So what are we going to talk about this week? Have you noticed what's happening with Joe Biden, or rather what's not happening? He's not answering questions from the press. It's not just that he hasn't held a solo press conference, and it's well past when his predecessors held their first press conferences. It's not just that he hasn't scheduled an address to a joint session of Congress, something that new presidents typically do within a week or two after taking office, and something which Biden promised in January that he would do in February. It's that he also isn't taking questions from the press after appearances in person or by video feed, and what's particularly odd is that twice recently he's appeared like he might take questions during video appearances, but the video feed was cut. In one of those appearances, when he was addressing House Democrats by video, he actually said, quote, "I'm happy to take questions if that's what I'm supposed to do," close quote. What happened next? The White House cut the video feed. That's right. It appeared the public was going to finally see the new president, Joe Biden, respond to questions. Now that was going to be interesting. Would he go into one of his patented rambling rants, insert some ill-advised off-color remark, mumble like a president, produced in some sort of failed laboratory experiment attempting to cross Bane from The Dark Knight with Mickey, the Brad Pitt character from the movie Snatch? And by the way, if you haven't seen the movie Snatch, watch it and then watch it again with subtitles. You'll realize just how much of the dialogue you missed from Pitt's character. Years ago, I had a boss who was amazingly vague and imprecise in his directions. He didn't mumble, but he rarely clearly stated what he wanted. I can remember talking with other attendees in the hallways after meetings trying to figure out what the big guy wanted us to do. Now, if you were part of the team relying on that group, it would be more than a little bit disconcerting to realize that they were being given such poorly explained marching orders that they had to get together after meetings to try to figure out what they were. The responsibilities of the big guy, the supervisor, the boss in that scenario were certainly extensive. Clear communications is always at a premium, but the higher the position, the more power possessed, the more critical it is for the communication to be clear. And the position in that situation was quite high. Now think about it in the context of being the President of the United States, the most powerful nation in the history of the planet. I'm reminded of an old skit from Saturday Night Live back from one of the times when actor, writer, and director Buck Henry was guest hosting. In one skit, he portrayed a veteran nuclear plant control room supervisor who everyone relied on, and he was going on vacation for the first time in his career. Everyone was a bit nervous about controlling the reactor in his absence. Just before he left for his vacation, he gave what he described as the one thing you have to remember about controlling a nuclear reactor, and that was, quote, "You can't put too much water into a nuclear reactor," close quote. And then he walked out of the control room for his trip. There was a slight delay before the studio audience got the joke, but only a couple of seconds. After that brief delay, they realized, as the other players in the skit later depicted, that the statement, "you can't put too much water into a nuclear reactor," is ambiguous. I would argue the most reasonable interpretation is don't worry about putting more water than needed, just worry about putting in less than needed. But some people might interpret, quote, "you can't put," close quote, as equivalent to don't put, as in don't put too much water into a nuclear reactor. Now that skit wouldn't seem at first blush to be funny, but it was. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying it's one of the great Saturday Night Live skits, but it was funny. What made the skit funny was the fact that the setting was a nuclear power plant, We've all faced situations where we don't quite know what our boss wanted or directed, so you reset the same skit in a department store or a freight terminal or a corporate sales department, and it's just not funny. But set it at a nuclear power plant where the stakes are so incredibly high that you just can't deny the absurdity of having the safety of multitudes depend on one sentence from a guy leaving on vacation, the incongruity between a site that demands the strictest, most well-defined, most rigorous standards to safeguard millions, and the workforce tasked with that job instead depended on 10 casually spoken words from a guy heading to the beach. The absurdity, the incongruity makes it funny. But you know when it's not funny? When it's real. Kayleigh McEnany on Fox News, my favorite presidential press secretary of all time, recently made the point that she thinks President Biden isn't taking questions, he isn't holding press conferences because his own staff doesn't have any faith in him. They think if he takes questions, he'll screw it up. He'll make a commitment that's contrary to their plan. As McEnany notes, when Biden speaks, quote, it doesn't always turn out so well, close quote. So how is this like the nuclear reactor skit? Well, in this instance, Joe Biden, the President of the United States, is like the inexperienced nuclear plant workers who can't maintain the safety of the facility when the guy that knows what he's doing goes on vacation. In this case, it would seem the guy that knows what he's doing is the White House staff, or at least they think they know. I'm not sure which is more disconcerting, that there are legitimate questions over whether President Biden is sufficiently alert, aware, and in possession of his faculties to be able to take questions at a podium, or the fact that he seems to have left it up to his staff to decide whether he is. You recall what he said just before the White House cut the video feed. Quote, I'm happy to take questions if that's what I'm supposed to do, close quote. He's leaving that decision up to the staff. Joe Biden, as President of the United States, can't decide whether he's supposed to take questions, or perhaps the staff already told him not to and he forgot. I guess there's one thing you have to remember when preparing Joe Biden for a speaking engagement. You can't give Joe Biden too many instructions. Next topic. Funding failure. If you're like me, you've watched with both interest and dismay as states around the country have taken dramatically different approaches in reaction to COVID. We talked about that several times on this podcast, but I'm going to take a different angle this time. But first, give me 1 minute to set the predicate. We know that blue states have typically locked down their economies for a much longer time than red states, and many blue states have locked down their economies to a much greater extent than red states. And as much of the national news media has hyperventilated about red states either opening up earlier than they thought they should, or red states not locking down as much as the media thought they should, the huge spikes in COVID-19 deaths predicted by the media and warned about by the experts haven't really come to pass. As I've noted before, the red state, which has become the standard for more moderate lockdowns and ending them earlier than other major states, Florida, has a per capita death total which is below the national average, a shockingly positive statistic given that Florida is one of the 2 states in the country with the highest percentage of seniors in its population. You would have expected Florida's COVID death totals on a per capita basis to be among the highest in the country. They simply aren't. And Florida has achieved that success even though its lockdown of the economy was much less severe and much shorter than in states like New York, New Jersey, Illinois, and California, for example. As a result, Florida's unemployment rate is below the national average, and as Republican Governor Ron DeSantis has noted, Florida has not had to dip into its rainy day fund set aside for emergencies to balance the budget. You'd think that would be worthy of praise, but it certainly hasn't been from the media and from Democrat Party leadership. As we know from watching it week after week on cable news, Florida Ron DeSantis is effectively public enemy number 1 for the media. Success, as he's enjoyed it, just simply isn't acceptable to the bulk of the news media. And apparently the success that Florida has enjoyed isn't acceptable to Democrats in Congress or the Biden administration either. Why do I say that? because the COVID relief package that passed the House and squeaked through the Senate despite Republican opposition punishes states like Florida. You've heard the budget number for that package, and it's truly staggering. $1.9 trillion. That's right, trillion with a T. You know what they say, trillion is the new billion. And for all of the talk about the $1,400 payments to individuals in the latest tranche of the program, that represents just over $400 billion of the $1.9 trillion total cost. Sure, $400 billion is enormous, but let's pause for a moment to recognize that I just said, sure, $400 billion is a lot, but we've actually reached the point where someone can reference $400 billion and then explain that it's not as big as it seems. That is truly frightening. So what was the but there? The but is that $400 billion is less than a quarter of the total for the bill. But over $500 billion is allocated to state and local governments, and that's where state governments which dealt with COVID without tanking their economies get punished. Now, an excellent argument can be made that such a massive set of payments to state and local governments shouldn't be made at all. They should be able to handle those costs. They should have rainy day funds, as Florida and many other states do. Moreover, the economic impact on tax revenues in many respects has been less than expected. Moreover, I would argue that the states which suffered the most severe effects did so because they overreacted. Rather than protecting their at-risk populations, such as seniors, they instead chose to shut down wide swaths of their economies. But it was those decisions, those overreactions, those authoritarian mandates in states like California, Illinois, and New York, which are being subsidized and thereby encouraged in the future by the COVID relief bill. How, you might ask? By bailing out the states with funding being allocated based on the size of the state's unemployed population. So the more the state shut down its own economy, the more the federal government will spend to pay it for having done so. You know what they say, you get what you pay for. When you incentivize conduct, you get more of it. And when the federal government pays $500 billion to state and local governments for overreacting and shutting down their economies, it's just asking for it to happen again. I used to say that if we ever had a pandemic like COVID again, states will be much less likely to overreact by shutting down their economies. Well, the new COVID relief package makes me question my prediction. If you pay states for bad decisions, what do you get? More bad decisions. Next topic. A well-spoken fox. I've certainly had my fill of the ridiculous woke extremism of the left, of the authoritarian and totalitarian restrictions imposed in the wake of COVID coming mostly from Democrats at the state and local level, of the attempts to rewrite history, the shutdowns of any speech which doesn't conform to their woke views of our country, what it needs to be, and where it should go. And for all of the time I spend reading about what's happening in Washington and across the 50 states, it's a good thing to be periodically reminded that the struggles people face with woke extremism are not limited to the borders of America. And one of the places outside of America where I read on a regular basis about the incursions of woke policies and practices into political bodies and bureaucratic entities which threaten the individual rights of citizens is the country from which America sprung and its most glorious city. But for all I've read about London and the disappointment I've felt as Boris Johnson has seemed less and less like a conservative, even by European standards, perhaps I should call him Boris, quote, Mitt, close quote, Johnson, I didn't realize until recently that an English actor has started a third party dedicated to fighting the culture wars, to beating back the advancement of woke lunacy. And that actor, Lawrence Fox, is running for mayor of London. Now, whenever an actor runs for political office, you tend to get a better quality of advertisement, a better quality of speech. It doesn't make them better politicians, but you can make a pretty good argument that being an actor is great training for running for office. Watch the performances of Ronald Reagan on the campaign trail and try to deny that fact. He was so aware of the importance of appearances, of the importance of the visual, that whenever he'd ride on Air Force One, he would do so after taking off his suit pants and switching into sweatpants. His suit pants would then be perfectly pressed, and he'd put them on immediately before walking through the door out of Air Force One. Of course, to the clicking of scores of cameras capturing his perfectly crisp appearance, straight out of central casting within the door frame. James Dellingpole at Breitbart made essentially the same point today about Lawrence Fox, not anything about wearing sweatpants and crisply pressed suit pants while standing at the threshold of a presidential jet, but rather simply that actors tend to make very polished presentations in political commercials, and the commercial he was referencing is well worth watching. It's Lawrence Fox's political ad in support of his campaign. He posted on Twitter with the message, quote, "Reclaim London, reclaim your freedom," close quote. It's only 2 minutes and 5 seconds long, so even if you're not a Londoner, it's worth watching to get a flavor for the fact that you and I are far from the only ones fed up with the authoritarian government overreaction to COVID and the terrifying expansion of woke extremism in the structures of society. Dellingpole correctly pinpoints the most effective line in the ad. Quote, "Nobody should ever say their last goodbyes to anybody on an iPad ever again." Close quote. Truer words were never spoken. I don't know whether Lawrence Fox can win the London mayoral election, but I sure hope his beliefs expressed in the ad gain traction. We'll see what happens. And here on this side of the pond, I know what will happen, at least next week. I'll be releasing another episode of Political Spirits as always. Please be sure to listen and tell your friends to do so as well, and like the podcast on Facebook at Political Spirits, and follow me and the podcast on Twitter at Franklin Rye. And remember, all episodes are now on YouTube as well, and the YouTube channel is named Political Spirits Network. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe and hit the notification bell, and select all after you hit the bell. This is Franklin Rye. Thank you for listening.